Hi, good evening, and welcome to JW3. The good thing is you've seen everything now, so we can just move on to Kiddish. So I'm Raymond Simonson. I'm very privileged to be the CEO of JW3. We like to think of ourselves as the home for Jewish culture and conversation, and one of the things we like to do is to bring high-quality conversations to this stage to our audiences as often as we can. And so tonight, I am really, really thrilled to be partnering with, actually, it's one of my favourite organisations and one of the lesser-known organisations, I think, in the Jewish community to a lot of people. Although looking out, I can see a lot of friends in the room, a lot of community leaders and professionals and lay people, which is no surprise because we're the ones who know a lot about the work of the Institute of Jewish Policy Research. And that's a good reminder to give you the housekeeping. So firstly, please, that was set up. Please, if your phones are not on silent yet, please do turn them on silent. If you're going to take any photos, please make sure the flash is off. Why you would be taking any photos of us, I do not know. But please, just turn the flash off. These lights are bright enough for us. There are more people that have booked than are currently in the room, and we are aware that a mixture of the weather and the fire at Tally-Ho Corner, which I know that's got northwest London all excited all day, has meant that there's been a bit of traffic problems. So we've been told that there are people still arriving and will be arriving. So if the empty seats in your row are in the middle, you are more likely to have people pushing past you and stepping on your toes. So do feel free to shuffle along and leave the empty seats nearer the end, especially on that end, and our team will try and get people in nice and quietly and quickly. Okay. What I'm going to do is hand straight over to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Jonathan Boyd, who is the CEO of Jewish Policy Research Institute, JPR, and he's going to kick us off this evening and tell us why we're here.
Great, thank you so much. It's very, very bright, the lights. I can't really see everybody, but hello, everybody. I actually wanted just to start by thanking Raymond and JW3 for putting on this event. They're hosting it for free, although obviously it costs them money to put it on. And I think that just kind of captures the generosity of spirit of this organisation and the commitment to community development and community enhancement. And I just really wanted to start by thanking you and the team. That really should not go unrecognised. So thank you, Raymond. Even though I really can't see who's out there because the lights are very, very bright, thank you everybody in the room for coming out tonight. It's a cold, wet, miserable February evening, and I'm acutely conscious that we're in a period of time when October the 7th and everything that's going on in Israel is very much on everyone's minds and kind of dominates community discourse and I think our own emotions and feelings in many, many different respects. And it's difficult really to think about anything else beyond that at the moment. But tonight we're going to try and think about other things. We will touch a little bit on anti-Semitism in Israel. But what we're interested in looking at today are the results of the new Institute for Jewish Policy Research National Jewish Identity Survey. We're looking at Jewish identity. We're looking at the kind of the building blocks, if you like, or the nature of Jewish identity in Britain today. And I think it's, in many respects, very timely to do that because perhaps particularly at times of stress and difficulty and trauma, it's really important to keep an eye on how do we build a rich, meaningful, sustainable Jewish community. And the data that we're sharing this evening are really about trying to do that and trying to keep focused on that question. So I'm going to share some PowerPoint slides. That's kind of what I do. And let me just get this PowerPoint ready. And maybe you guys at the back can put it up on the screen. There we go. Okay. So I want to start a little bit by just explaining the survey, the data that we are looking at. Just some of the background to the study, if you like, because it's important that people understand where this is all coming from. So the first thing to say is that these are data that were gathered about a year ago. They were gathered in November and December 2022. So all of the data we're looking at predate everything that has happened over the course of the last 4 months. So this is, in a sense, a snapshot of Jewish identity on the eve of that war. I think it's actually really, really critical that people, first of all, people that understand that. But it's also, I think, important ultimately in trying to understand how the community has been impacted by that war, because in many respects, these are the data that serve as the benchmark against which to analyse change over time. The second thing just to say about the survey, this is a survey that was conducted online at that time. There are 4,891 respondents to this survey, making it the biggest study of Jewish identity in this country that we've ever conducted. The people in it are self-identified Jews, aged 16 and over, living in the UK. Everybody who participated in the survey is a member of the JPR research panel. Very quickly, our research panel is a very ambitious and innovative initiative. There is no other Jewish research panel in the world. And essentially what it is a standing database of people of all different types, Jews of all different types, different age groups, different denominations, living in different parts of the community, different levels of attachment to the community and engagement in the community, who have signed up to participate in our surveys. And I want to actually just very quickly acknowledge my colleague, I can't see her in the room, but I know she's here, Dr. Carly Lesoff, who manages that part of our work and was very much involved in setting up this survey, in managing the methodology, and in very much kind of shaping the whole project. So a big thank you to Carly. This is I'm presenting this work, but there's a whole team behind me. The other person I also want to acknowledge who's not in the room is Dr. David Graham, my co-author, who actually lives in Sydney, Australia, which is a bit of a long commute to get to tonight. But he's also a key player in terms of conducting this work and writing up the report, which we will share with you at the end. The other thing to say about the research panel is I know that there are a number of people in the room who are members of the research panel and who participate in the survey. So I just want to acknowledge those people and thank them for participating in this study. We can't do our work unless people sign up to our research panel and participate in our surveys. So I would encourage people to do that if you haven't already signed up, because there will be more surveys happening in the future. Having done the field work, what we do is we weight the data to make sure that the sample aligns with the socio-demographic profile of the Jewish community. So we make sure that it fits in terms of the age profile, the sex profile, the geography profile, the synagogue membership profile. So what we're looking at here is as representative a sample as I think it's possible to build of Jews in this country. Another thing that we did with this survey, just very quickly, is when we constructed the questionnaire and the weighting strategy, we had an eye on a study that we conducted 10 years ago in 2013, the National Jewish Community Survey, because we were interested not just simply in looking at Jewish identity today, but also looking at how things have changed over the course of the last decade, and I will talk a little bit about that this evening. This is a big study. It is a really comprehensive study, and I really hope that the report that we're launching today serves as a key reference point for community leaders and professionals over the coming years. It covers a lot of different topics: religious belief and practice, communal belonging, education, intermarriage, Israel, Zionism, anti-Semitism, charitable giving, volunteering, etc., etc. You saw some of the issues in the video. I should also acknowledge Omri Gal, our brilliant director of communications, who put that together and was very involved in helping to deal with the whole marketing strategy around this report. The other thing I want to just flag up in advance is that behind the report and behind the data I will share with you tonight is a data set, a data file, if you like. And when we do this research, we are not interested in simply just looking at Jewish identity and getting some headlines in the press. We build our data sets in order to create a resource that can be used by the community, by community professionals, by community leaders, in order to help them plan for the future. So one of the things I want to say clearly to community leaders who are in the room today is that this data is available to you. And if there's anything I say or any of the issues that come up that you think, oh, that's interesting, I'd quite like to look at that in more detail, then feel free to be in touch with us and we can talk about how to explore this data set to look at those particular issues in more depth. This is vast, it covers a lot of different ground, and I can only really scratch the surface of what's in it tonight. All of that's background. Let me jump in and talk a little bit about what is Jewish identity and the fact that there are multiple ways of thinking about our Jewishness. And one of the questions in the survey that we ask is kind of summarized here. the question is, how important or unimportant are these different dimensions of Jewishness to how you see yourself as a Jewish person? Is your Jewishness about remembering the Holocaust, giving to charity, belief in God, prayer, kashrut, supporting Israel, marrying someone Jewish, observing Shabbat? There are lots of different dimensions of Jewishness, and if you just think about it yourself, I'm sure there are certain elements, certain things here that will resonate with you more than others. We asked the entire sample, how important are these things to you in terms of how you see yourself as a Jewish person? And here are the results for the Jewish population as a whole. These are the proportions of people who say these things are very important to how I see myself as a Jewish person today. At the top of the list is remembering the Holocaust, and third on the list, kind of perhaps related, is combating anti-Semitism. Second on the list is strong moral and ethical behavior. Feeding part of the Jewish people is also high up there on the list. If you go to the bottom, you can see that things like some of the religious dimensions of Jewishness, studying religious texts, prayer, kashrut, belief in God, come much lower down on the list, and we will explore that in a little bit. I want to show you this as well, though. This is what we found a decade ago. We asked basically the same question a decade ago, and to see how things have shifted. And the first thing to say is actually things haven't shifted dramatically, but there are some notable things. And actually an easy way to see it is by looking at this chart, which is the proportionate change of each of these things over the course of the last 10 years. So what are the things that seem to have become important to more of us over the course of the last 10 years? Well, the things that really stand out here are remembering the Holocaust, combating anti-Semitism. Those aspects have become important to more of us in terms of how we see ourselves Jewishly. Whether that's a good or bad thing, maybe we'll talk about that in just a second. But that's one of the key things. And perhaps that's no great surprise, given that over the course of that 10-year period, we've had the whole Labour Party issue, Jeremy Corbyn issue. We've also had several waves of wars in Gaza in 2014, in 2021, and of course now, and associated spikes in anti-Semitic incidents in this country following those or in response to those. So I get why these things are important, but I think there's an interesting conversation to be had about them. At the other end of the spectrum, things that have become less important, again, some of the religious dimensions of Jewishness, belief in God, prayer, intermarriage, interestingly, has become a little less important, concern about that. Again, much to talk about here, but we can see some shifts happening. Are these good shifts? Are these bad shifts? Well, that's, I think, part of the conversation. But there's another question I wanted to explore through looking at this question. And as I said, this is just one question of many in this survey. And that is, what do we have in common? One of the big issues, I think, in the Jewish community is, as we see perhaps the Jewish community becoming more polarized and more separated out, more diffuse, are we Am echad im lev echad, one people with one heart, or are we becoming increasingly diffuse, polarized, etc.? What do we have in common? And one sort of simple way of looking at that is through these 18 items. I'm going to share this slide, and I know it's horrific, and I know there's like lots of words, lots of numbers. I really apologize. I promise you, however overwhelming it may be, you will understand this brilliantly in just a minute. What are we looking at here? So, first of all, the words reflect those 18 items that we've just explored, these different aspects of Jewishness that may or may not be important. But they're in columns, because one of the other questions we ask people is, if you had to define how you see yourself Jewishly in kind of denominational terms, would you say you are Haredi, Orthodox, traditional, Reform, progressive, non-practicing, secular? Like, which of those best fits who you are today? This is not what synagogue do you belong to, it's like, how do you see yourself denominationally? So, and what we're looking at is those groups. So, for example, if you look at the left-hand column, the non-practicing one at the top, you can see that 74% of people who identified as non-practicing or secular said that commemorating the Holocaust is very important to their Jewish identity. Look at the bottom of that list, and 1% of them said prayer is important to them. Go to the other end of the spectrum and look at the Haredi list on the right. All Haredi Jews said kashrut is very important to them, but only 20% of them at the bottom of that list said Jewish culture is important to them. So you can kind of get a sense of what are the priorities and what are important. And I'm interested kind of here mainly in looking at the order, The proportions, the numbers are also important, but let's focus primarily on the order. Because one of the things we can see when we look at it this way is all of these items are religious, right? Belief in God, observing Shabbat, studying texts, kashrut, prayer. But where do they come in the order of priorities among different groups? You see a very kind of different picture depending on which denominational group we're looking at. So amongst the non-practicing, the progressive, and indeed the traditional, which is a kind of a marker for your sort of mainstream United Synagogue, these things are pretty low down on the list. Move into the more Orthodox or Haredi world, and they start to move right up. Clear distinctions in terms of how we understand the importance of these kind of religious items. What about remembering the Holocaust and combating anti-Semitism, those dimensions of Jewishness? Well, for the non-practicing, the progressive, the traditional, these are very high up. Move to the Orthodox and Haredi part of the community, they are much lower down. That's interesting, by the way, because it's actually Orthodox and Haredi Jews who are much more likely to experience anti-Semitic incidents than the other three groups. But in terms of how they see their Jewishness and what's important to them, they come much lower down on the list. Supporting Israel. Generally kind of a mid-ground position, less important for Haredi Jews, but somewhere in the middle. May have shifted as a result of October the 7th. I think there's certainly a conversation to be had. Whether it shifted up or down, I think there's a question there. But that's what we're picking up. Peoplehood, feeling part of the Jewish people. That's quite high up for everybody, slightly lower down among Haredim, but it's in that kind of high up amongst the other groups. This one strikes me as really interesting because if there's one dimension of Jewishness that comes in the top 5 across all denominations, it is moral and ethical behavior. Now, there's a whole discussion to be had about what do people mean by moral and ethical behavior, but I think what's really striking here for me is that across the Jewish people, across different denominations and different understandings of Jewishness, there is a sense that within Judaism there is a moral imperative that comes with being a Jew. And if we're interested in the question of commonality, it seems like maybe there's something interesting to explore here, at the very least, in terms of how we might build a more cohesive Jewish community. We can look at these data, and I'll try and skip through this quickly as well, in a different way. This is looking at it by age groups. So rather than looking at denominations, let's look at it by kind of generational groups. So on the left, we've got 16 to 29-year-olds. Next group, 30 to 49-year-olds, 50 to 69-year-olds, 70-plus-year-olds on the right. So different age groups. And again, this is the order of priority that these different age groups said that were, how important these things were to them. What do we see when we look at it through this lens? Well, these are the religious items. Now, we've seen already that these things tend to come quite low down on the list. But one of the things that I think is quite striking here is that they're slightly higher, slightly more important to people in that 30 to 49 age band, more so than the other age groups. And perhaps, Raymond, one of the things we might want to chat about is why that might be the case. But there's certainly something there. And by the way, that is a pattern that we see in the report around a number of different things. Lighting Hanukkah candles, attending a Seder, fasting on Yom Kippur. There's an interesting kind of spike amongst that age band that is, I think, worth exploring. Commemorating the Holocaust, combating anti-Semitism, high across the board, not much of a generational difference on that. Peoplehood, similarly, feeling part of the Jewish people, similarly comes pretty high up and across the board. Ethical behavior, as we've talked about, again, high up across the board, not much difference. Comes slightly lower among 16 to 29-year-olds, but not dramatically so. This one's interesting, supporting Israel. Here we see a kind of an interesting denominational shift happening. Again, this predates October the 7th. It may have changed, but I wasn't surprised to see this. The older you are, the more likely you are to say that supporting Israel is an important piece of your Jewish identity, and it's become less so as we look across the generations. Again, we're looking at Jews of all sorts, all denominations here. We're just looking at this through the lens of age bands. And the last one I wanted to share is Jewish culture. This is good news for you, Raymond, maybe. That Jewish culture comes fairly low down on the list of priorities for most age groups, but it's actually higher amongst young people. It's it comes there in seventh place. They are saying that is more important to their sense of Jewish identity than the older three age groups. So there's a lot here. I'm conscious there are a lot of different issues that this raises, but what I'm interested in primarily, if I have to summarise this, we're looking partly at the nature of how Jewishness and Jewish identity may have changed somewhat over the course of the last 10 years, and this broader question of what is it that we have in common? What is it that might bind us together in some way? I'm going to stop here. Maybe we'll have a little chat about some of this stuff, and then I'm going to come back and share some more with you in a moment.
Whew. Right. I honestly, first of all, just as an observation, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I'll be back on in a second, I'm sure. There you go. Firstly, just one observation is, 10 years we've been doing events, and I've sat on this stage or been in the room for just thousands of them. Rarely have I been in an event where someone is presenting and there's such a murmur and a ripple from something they've said. And the cameras came out, and the minute there was a generational divide on Israel, the cameras came out to capture it. So at some point, probably after this, at the very end, when we go out there for cups of tea, I want to find out what were the things that really caught people and they were chatting around. Right, there's so much to unpack in that, but we're only going to spend about 10 minutes or so having a bit of a chat because there's more that I want you to tell us about. Let's start with that one that you mentioned just before about the religiosity scene, practice, Shabbat and lighting Hanukkah candles and things, and that difference in the generations with that peak, that spike in the 30 to 49. We're just outside. In that age group.
Do you feel it? Do you feel the difference?
I don't know if there are some people in that age group in the room, aren't there? Let's just, we're all going to nod. No, you're not. What is it about that? I mean, I've got my own thoughts, which I'll share if they're not shown by the data. Right. Okay. So look, everyone's a data scientist.
Right. Yeah.
What is it about that? What are the obvious things that people are thinking?
So I think there are two hypotheses, right? One is that there's a kind of a well-known phenomenon in Jewish social sciences and study of kind of Jewish identity, and that is, it's phrased by American Professor Stephen Cohen as "all for the children" was the kind of the phrase he used, and that there's a stage in life when people have young kids, perhaps particularly the period up to bar mitzvah, and maybe beyond for some, where people are just more likely to try to do those, express those kind of religious aspects of Jewishness in their homes, to try and make sure that they impart it to their children. And there is, I think, something really interesting in the data that shows that or suggests that. The other hypothesis, though, I think is quite an interesting one, and I have no way of proving it, but if you think about people who are 30 to 49 today, they're basically people who were born roughly between, let's say, the mid-70s and the mid-90s, right? So they came of age around kind of, I guess, in the mid-80s to mid-90s and beyond. There was something very interesting happening in this community around that time. In the early 90s was when the former Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs became Chief Rabbi. He started a very big initiative, right, called Jewish Continuity, which is about a big investment in Jewish education and in schools and in Israel Experience programs, etc. So that age group is probably the group that benefited most from that kind of regeneration, if you like, or renewal was the kind of the term we use of Jewish life. It's possible that had some impact.
Right.
But I think both, and the answer is probably a bit of both of those things. But I think there's
look, I have like a lot of people in this room, I have a bias towards both of those things. Right. So I'm a parent with two teens, and so what we do at home matters. I can't look the audience in the face, I'm embarrassed to say, matters more to me now than it did before I had kids. Mm-hmm. So things we do at home, just literally from the first day, from the first week my first child was born, we started lighting Shabbat candles, which I hadn't done at home for years. Mm-hmm. And we started doing them well, religiously. And I know so many people that have that same thing. And suddenly Shabbat and going to synagogue, and I see it in the synagogue I go to with young families, and I'm seeing people I hadn't seen for quite a few years, and their kids are just at that age where they're thinking about schools and they're thinking about, so will my grandchildren be Jewish and all of that.
Yeah.
And the other bias that I have, you and I and quite a few people in this room came from that background where we benefited from that era of Jewish renewal, continuity into renewal, with the investment in Jewish youth movements that really was at its peak, certainly or the investment itself was at its peak in the 90s and first decade of the 2000s. And the growth of the summer tours and the summer camps and the huge growth of Jewish schools. So there were simply more young Jewish people doing more Jewish things.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And we should come back to that theme.
And we should come to that.
Hold that.
Can we talk a little bit about that Israel piece, the thing that got everybody sort of murmuring and chattering? And, I think, so one of the things I find I've seen in the community for years with research is there's two reactions I often see, neither of which are helpful to you. One is...
I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, one is I see the stats and, they're just wrong. Right? They're wrong because they say something opposite to the thing that I know and I believe. Or they say the thing, they're right because I agree with them. Well, that was a waste of time because I knew that anyway. Right? And that is, I hear that a lot. And I was getting a sense of both of those from people. Of course. And people going, no, that can't be.
Those are the two classics.
Those are the two,
all
right.
of our work, yeah.
So that one on Israel, younger generations, less engaged. And again, as John said before, this was taken pre-October 7th, and I'd be fascinated. Are you doing anything yet around the kind of, since October 7th, asking these kind of questions? Who's more engaged?
So we're starting to. I think our plan is to run a survey later this year. One of the challenges, I think, of looking at these sorts of issues in the midst of an event of that scale is that you may well get distorted readings. So we're kind of interested in just waiting a little bit till the dust has settled, and then we will pick it up again. And of course, I think there are three hypotheses of what we could find. One is that actually supporting Israel has become more important. That's distinctly possible, and I think I hear that sense from kind of a lot of people, particularly the kind of more engaged part of the community. The counter hypothesis is actually the kind of the scale and the nature of Israel's response in Gaza may have turned a lot of younger Jews off, and therefore they may distance themselves more from Israel in response to that. That's also possible, and of course there's there's the middle ground one, which actually is people will kind of revert back to what they thought in due course and probably say similar things again, and that's really a question of how significant is this event in terms of shaping us? Right. And that's going to take us a little bit of time to unpick. But, assuming we get the funding for it, we will run that survey a little bit later this year.
And just one important clarification, and you probably already all got this, right? But I just want to stress it for my sake, is that question wasn't showing how much someone supports Israel or what your support of Israel is. It was how much does supporting Israel, how important is that in defining your Jewish identity?
Yeah, correct.
So all of this is about how we define ourselves as Jews, right?
Yeah. And the role that I guess that Israel plays in our Jewish identity. Right. How important is it to our sense of Jewishness? I think that's probably also what it picks up.
So would you assume that people who say that Israel is a much less important part of defining their Jewish identity, would the assumption be that they support Israel less? Or can someone be, no, I really care passionately about Israel, but that's just not a major part of my Jewish identity?
So it could be either of those. But it's, I think one of the thoughts about Israel with younger people is that there's possibly a sense that Israel is just kind of normal. It's just been there their whole lives. So it doesn't feel like such a big deal. It doesn't feel quite as sort of miraculous as I think it does for people who went through, certainly kind of experienced 48 or experienced 67 in a very visceral way. Young people didn't have that. When you look at that 16 to 29 age group, their experience of Israel has been a much more challenging one, a much more difficult one. So in a sense, that might explain it. I think the other side of it is that huge proportions of us 88%, I believe, have been to Israel. And young people are more likely to have been to Israel, by the way, than older people. So it may also be that Israel's just kind of, it's just normal. It's just, it's part of what we've grown up with. It's part of our existence, and it's just, it doesn't need to play such an important role.
Right, because for those generations above, some of it was about, as you say, it was backs against the wall. It was Six-Day War, Yom Kippur War. I'm a little bit younger than that. For me, it was at a starting point, it would have been that normalization. But then it was excitement and handshakes and peace treaties and then murder of Rabin. Like that shaped a generation of which probably up to about age 50, maybe just under 50, but so in that bracket. Beyond that, as you say, it was either a negative experience on campus, maybe, or well, it's the place I go on holiday. It's the place my parents have a holiday home, or it's the place I have friends and family, and it becomes another country, and you don't really think about it in the same way. So I would be really shocked if, when you do the next piece of research, 6 months, a year, whatever it is, if that hasn't changed quite significantly, and that the place of Israel for people, even if there are some people that move way further the other way because they just cannot handle it, or whatever their political views, but for so many people it goes back up into defining who they are. If people have been out on marches, if people have been out sticking up posters for hostages and going to all the different things and things that are being said in synagogues, then Israel is so high on the agenda that one would think that would have a longer tail.
Yeah, I mean, you may well be right. The only way to know for sure is to ask the question and put it out there and see. And as I said, I think there are different hypotheses. Well, I think what's important in the finding here is that, as I said earlier, it gives us a baseline of where we were. It gives us a sense of what did the picture look like on the eve of that war. So if we're trying to get a sense of how has that affected things, if indeed it has, in which direction, we kind of need these data as the base to which to kind of look at data in the future. So it's coming. I can't tell you exactly what the situation is now, but we will get there because I think it's a critical question.
Right, there are loads more things I want to ask you, but I'm trying to be very careful to keep to time, or slightly over, obviously already. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to stand back up. We're going to put the spotlight back on you and just take us through some of the really interesting themes, some of the charts that stood out to you. And obviously I know, having read the entire report already, because I'm very good like that, there are hundreds of these charts, but just some that jump out to you.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think the question I'm almost always asked whenever we put a report out is, standing on one leg, what's the most important thing here? What stands out to you? What strikes you? What surprised you? That sort of question. And the truth is, I wanted to respond to it, but it's actually really difficult to do with this report because there's just so much in it. And the honest truth is, I could probably spend, I don't know, half an hour on more or less every single chart in this report. I know you probably want to go home at some point, so I'm going to focus in on four things. There are four things that strike me now. I think if you ask me the same question in 2 weeks' time, I might come up with different things, but I will share them with you because I think they're interesting to me at this stage. The first one is this one. You've already seen this chart, right? This is about the percentage change of how important these things were between 2013 and 2022 over the course of the last decade, and what's becoming more important to more of us, what's becoming less important to fewer of us over time. I'm really struck by these top two, remembering the Holocaust and combating anti-Semitism. Those have become more important to more of us over the course of the last 10 years. Now, in many respects, I completely understand that. I get it. Particularly anti-Semitism has featured very, very highly in the concerns of the community. And of course, as a community, we need to respond to that. We need to respond to it in terms of the security threats and issues, etc. But what we're looking at here is something slightly different, and that is we're looking kind of internally at how has that impacted our sense of self? How has it impacted our sense of Jewishness? And what we're seeing here is that when you ask people what's important to them about their Jewish identity, they're saying this stuff. They're saying remembering the Holocaust and combating anti-Semitism, that these things are becoming, in a sense, more central, more important to more of us in terms of how we understand our Jewish identities. And I titled this slide "The Memory Monster." I don't know how many people have read Yishai Sarid's book by that title, but it's worth reading. It's been translated into English now, so it's worth having a look at. But it's basically a book that explores like how distorting the Holocaust particularly, but also anti-Semitism can be in terms of how we understand our Jewishness and how it can affect the way in which we see ourselves Jewishly. And the question I suppose I want to pose is not that we shouldn't engage and deal with the threats of anti-Semitism, but I think there's a really important question for us as Jews and as a Jewish community here about how is all of that stuff impacting our sense of self? How is it impacting our identity? And I think one of the central questions really, perhaps in terms of thinking about Holocaust education in a Jewish context and anti-Semitism education in a Jewish context, is how do we deal with the traumas of the past and the traumas of the present in a way that is healthy, in a way that kind of allows us to grow and build and develop, so that we don't base our Jewish identities on the threats that exist out there and how they see us, but more on the positive aspects of Jewishness, Jewish values, Jewish ideas, Jewish beliefs, Jewish practices, etc. So that's number one. The second thing is what I call the 613 rule. People will be hopefully familiar with the number 613. It's not, by the way, the number of unanswered emails in my inbox, although it's probably pretty close. But here's what we're looking at here. We asked people, I've already kind of mentioned this, but we asked people, if you had to talk about or describe your upbringing, the kind of the family or the upbringing you had as a child in denominational terms, would you say your upbringing was Haredi, Orthodox, traditional, Reform, progressive, secular, etc.? Here we're looking at people who said their upbringing was Orthodox, top line, traditional, middle line, or Reform, progressive, the bottom line. Then there's a second question in here, which is, okay, that you've told us how you were, you've told us about your upbringing. Now tell us where you are now, how you would define your sort of denominational identity now. And we see something really, really interesting in this. And by the way, it's not the first time we've seen it. We published a report a few years ago, which was a study that we did for the European Union of Jewish identity across the EU. The report's on our website. It's written by my colleagues, Dr. Daniel Stetsky and Professor Sergio Della Pergola. It's also a very interesting read. But we saw the same thing when looking at European Jewish identity. Here we're seeing it very clearly in British identity. What are we seeing? That in all of these three groups, if you were brought up Orthodox or traditional or Reform or progressive, about 6 in 10 stay where they are. Right? They were brought up Orthodox, they're still Orthodox. They were brought up traditional, they're still traditional. About 1 in 10 have moved religiously rightwards, for want of a better term. They've become sort of more Orthodox, more observant, that kind of idea. And about 3 in 10 have moved religiously leftwards in some way. They've become kind of less observant or more liberal, or however we want to define it. I'm kind of quite careful about the words I use here because I don't want to diminish anything or anyone. But what's striking to me here is the same thing happens in all three groups. We often have this kind of stereotype of the Jewish world where, you know, the more Orthodox you are, the more likely you are to kind of maintain your Jewish identity. What this seems to suggest is, actually that's not true. We are all impacted in a very similar way. About 6 in 10 stay where we are, about 1 in 10 moves religiously rightwards, about 3 in 10 move religiously leftwards. And my best hunch about why this is happening is that we live in a secular society. The census data tell us that the proportion of people who say they have no religion in this country generally, not Jews, the population as a whole, has climbed from 14% to 37% in the last 20 years. Massive change. And that secularizing environment impacts all of us. And I think that's part of the reason why we see 3 times as many people moving leftwards as moving rightwards, but a lot of people staying put. Again, I think there's stuff to unpick here, but this is what I'm now starting to call the 613 rule. Here's another thing. We asked people about all sorts of different kind of informal, if you like, Jewish educational experiences that people have had, and did you have a bar or bat mitzvah? Were you involved in a youth club or a youth movement? Did you go on a summer camp? Did you go on an Israel tour? Were you a part of a university Jewish society? Did you go on a gap year program, etc., all of these sorts of things. I'm not going to dwell on this slide too much. I really just wanted to show you what the items are, and there are 14 of them. And when we look at the population as a whole, on average, Jews in Britain have done 4 of these. But here's what's interesting. When we cross-reference this with a question about how strong is your religiosity, is it very strong, quite weak, very weak? The stronger your religiosity, the more of these activities you are likely to have done. The average for those who said their religiosity is very strong is 5.3, compared to those who said their religiosity is very weak, just 3.1. Proportion of close friends that are Jewish. Are all or nearly all of your close friends Jewish? To none or very few of them are Jewish. We see the same pattern. If all or nearly all of your friends are Jewish, you will have done more of these things than if none or very few of them. And there's clearly a kind of a linear relationship there. How attached you are to the Jewish community. Very attached to not at all attached, or there is no community where I live. Again, the same pattern. The more attached, the more of these things you will have done. Attachment to Israel. From very attached to not at all attached, the more attached, the more of these things you would have done. The phrase I want to use to try and capture this concept, and it's one that we've used in previous research, but it very much kind of came back to me when looking at this, is the more you do, the more you do. I kind of grappled with whether that's the phrase or whether it's the more you do, the more you are, or the more Jewish you are. But anyway, let's go with the more you do, the more you do. There's a relationship between how many activities, how much of Jewish life you participate in, and all of these sorts of indicators: strength of religiosity, how much embedded in Jewish social networks you are, how attached you are to the Jewish community, how attached you are to Israel. We see that relationship very, very clearly. The last thing I wanted to talk about was this chart, and that is an interesting relationship between attachment to community and signs of mental well-being. So there's a module of questions in the survey about well-being, and there are a couple of questions here which are: how satisfied are you with your life nowadays, and how happy did you feel yesterday? And there's a scale. You can put yourself on a scale from 0 to 10, and you situate yourself. The higher the number, the happier or more satisfied you are. The lower, the less happy, the less satisfied you are. And we're cross-referencing that with attachment to community. So if you look at the left, these are people who say they are not at all attached to the community, and they score lower on both these measures. If you look at those on the right, the strongly attached to the community, the higher they score. Now, there's a correlation here. There isn't necessarily causation, and that's important. But there is a lot of literature on the relationship between community engagement, community participation, and mental well-being. And this really struck me because, we are kind of acutely conscious that we live in an increasingly, I think, individualistic world. Lots of people on their devices. We know that there's a mental health crisis, particularly among young people. And it seems to me that in these data, we're being told something about one of the great strengths of the Jewish community, that one of the things the community offers is a place where we can be together, where we can find a sense of community, where we can find a sense of collectivity, where we can find a sense of solidarity. And it seems to me in many respects, our community, if we build it well, is and can be an important antidote to some of the mental health challenges that we see around us. So, as I said, correlation, not causation, but there's something, I think, in this that is worth considering. I'll stop. Lots to think about. As I said, many, many other charts that I could pick out, but let's go with those for the time being.
Brilliant. Just absolutely fascinating. And again, there's so many things we could delve into, but we haven't got time. So I'm going to just pick a few that really interested me and jumped out to me. So, firstly, that whole issue about remembering the Holocaust and combating anti-Semitism. Again, remember, this was pre-October 7th, so we would expect these things to be high. But 20%, give or take, a 20% increase in the importance of those things to people's Jewish identity over 10 years, right?
Or the number of people who say that
The
it's
number of
important
people.
to their identity, yeah.
So it's statistically that's significant, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess the first thing that just jumped out to me as someone whose whole background was in kind of informal Jewish education and whose life now is about positive Jewish experiences is I look at that and go, wow, top of the charts for the things that give people a strong, meaningful Jewish identity are the two most negative things on the entire list. Like that's my honestly, that's my first. That's not pointing fingers of blame at all of you that answered in that way. But really, that I don't know whether I should be depressed or worried or think, have I failed in 30 years of trying to do, positive Jewish experience? Or, no, that's just important that we understand that and build that into the programs we run. Like, can you help me unpack that a bit?
Look, I think it's partly just the potency of this stuff. I mean, particularly contemporary anti-Semitism. But I think also the kind of the historical trauma of the Holocaust. I think it weighs very, very heavily on the Jewish community all over the world, and so it's not unsurprising. I mean, we're still just 80 years since the Shoah, and it's still kind of very much, I think, alive in our lives. There's still plenty of survivors around, about 240,000 around the world still around. So it's so this. It's living, it's breathing, and it impacts, like it hits us right in the guts, right? Particularly when it's bad or we feel threatened. So I'm not, it doesn't surprise me that people are saying this stuff impacts us. It's natural that it does. But yeah, I share your concern that trying to build a Jewish identity on the foundations of anti-Semitism or indeed the Holocaust, I think, is a fool's game. It's really, really important, I think, for the community and for community leadership to think about how do we build Jewishness on more positive things. But I think the critical piece about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, as I kind of said previously, is how it's not enough just to kind of dismiss it. I think the question is how do we engage with Holocaust and anti-Semitism in a real way, but in a healthy way? How do we incorporate the realities of all of that into our Jewishness in a way that is constructive and helpful
and healthy,
and indeed healthy? Yeah.
Which
is not easy.
No, it really isn't. And I also think about, we often use the language here. We call it tent poles. When we're thinking, if you think about a tent pole and the tent goes up and down like that, and you have these moments, these big things that are tent pole moments, but what do you build off of the tail of it, right? You don't just leave it there. So if we know that people are engaging in Holocaust education and it's having a big impact on them, if we just leave it in a vacuum, right, it is just about the Holocaust and that's what's important, we don't get that other bit. If we say, well, that's part of a journey, we're going to also build the positive Jewish experience and Shabbatonim or Israel or whatever the things are, from religiosity to culture, whatever. And sometimes I worry there isn't enough, this is my personal critique, doesn't reflect the views of JPR, let alone JW3, but that we don't have enough of that joined up thinking. So there are organisations and people that care passionately about ensuring the memory of the Holocaust, and rightly they should. And there are people that really care about fighting anti-Semitism, and they should. And there are a bunch of other people trying to, sort of promote a religiosity and get more people keeping Shabbat. And sometimes I worry that because we don't have that joined up thinking, we don't get that effect of that. Does that kind of make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a really important issue about joined up thinking. And actually, I mean, I don't know whether you wanted to go there, but I think the more you do, the more you do issue is like kind of reflects that, because if we know that the more Jewish activities that people go through, the more likely they are to be commonly engaged and attached, etc., then as well as the kind of the content of those programs and the structure of the programs, the other critical piece is how do we link one program to the next? What's the follow-up? What's the connection? And there's, I think, also like a very important philosophical question there, because lots of organisations, I think, they take their kids or their people on a particular programme, and then they want their people to go on their next programme.
Yeah.
But their next programme might not be necessarily right for all their kids, and they might actually want to go to a different programme or a different organisation. So, and that's where I think kind of the connectivity becomes important, whether organisations can think in more broad communal terms and collective terms and think about what does this particular individual need in order to go on their journey and find their next thing. And that may not be something that we can offer, but what's our responsibility to that particular individual?
So we, and a lot of the we in this room, have a responsibility for increasing multiple entry points into Jewish life, into positive Jewish experiences, and not just thinking about what's the entry point into my organisation. And that's sometimes difficult because of a battle for limited resources and all of those things. But that bigger joined up thinking that some of the larger communal bodies do is important. I love the language. I have a bias. It's an organisation that's close to me, the language of Limud, about taking you one step further on your Jewish journey. And that Jewish journey might go in different directions. And I think that's something we've got to start as the leadership of the community thinking about more, not just, okay, here are the numbers, let's count the numbers through the doors. And the other bit is the language that I think has been problematic for years when people talk about follow-up. Oh, there's Israel tour, what's the follow-up? There's, whatever event you do, what's the follow-up? And follow-up implies that was the thing that happens important, then there's follow-up, as opposed to the thing that happened is one in a chain of many things. It's not the important. Is that a bit of a ramble? Does that make sense? Yeah? Do you know what I'm trying to say? That they actually don't see the next bit as follow-up because that was the important thing and that's just the after. Mm-hmm. Actually, it's what's the path? What's the journey we're going on? And I know there are people in this room that are involved in that thinking in their organisations. Certainly synagogues, and I can see a few synagogue executive directors and rabbis here. I think if you have a synagogue community, you're thinking about it because you're thinking from birth to death, and you're thinking about every step along the way. I just think we have to expand that thinking.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I also think it's very difficult for different parts of the community. So if you have a very clear idea of what Jewishness is, and quite a kind of a more traditional idea of what Jewishness is, then it's difficult, I think, for that part of the community to say, well, we don't really mind where people go Jewishly. It's okay for them to go on their journey on their own terms. Actually, I think it's much harder, I think, for the more orthodox parts of the community to say that. Should they open up that possibility? Should they explore that possibility? Is that something that we should be thinking about collectively together in some way? I mean, I think the conversation should happen at the very least.
I think one of the slides that jumped out to me based on that was around the greater or lesser, where different aspects of Jewish identity have either grown or shrunk. And the fact that if belief in God, if I jotted these down really quickly, but if belief in God was sort of 10% less important than it was 10 years ago, prayer 6% less, kashrut 4% less, but Jewish culture was 13% more, right? And feeling part of the Jewish community was 8% more. There's something about thinking about, well, how do we play some of those things in? If feeling part of the Jewish community is now more important than it was 10 years ago, if Jewish culture, and again, I've got a bias there, was more important, we have to think about not just combating the things, or how do we deal with the ones that have gone down, but taking the opportunity, because actually, to take Jewish culture and feeling part of a Jewish community, you could be an Israel organisation, or an Orthodox organisation, or a Reform organisation, or a youth movement, or, and still tap into those things. Yeah. So looking through multiple lenses is going to be, I think, more important if we want to grow Jewish identity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the counter-argument, of course, is that if we're seeing aspects of religiosity shifting sort of negatively, then I think there's a real question about how does one respond to that. And it might not just be building on those things that seem to be working, but why aren't those aspects of Jewishness working? Is that because we live in an increasingly secular society, or is it because the way in which we are speaking or engaging religiously is just not hitting home in some way? And if that's the case,
can we stem the tide?
Can we stem the tide? Is there are there changes that one needs to make in thinking about how one does that? Again, these are big questions.
And I know you said you couldn't sort of exactly confirm that that issue of the more attached you are to community, the better your sense of well-being. But I jump on that. That speaks to every experience. It's things I've heard. I think I saw Nikki from who runs JVN in the room. We've seen that with research on volunteering. The more you're involved in volunteering, the better your sense of well-being. Why is that? Well, maybe partly because you've done a good deed. You've done some chesed, tikkun olam, social action, whatever. Maybe it's because you usually do volunteering with other people as part of community. We see that here. I mean, anecdotally, we see that here all the time. There's a group of incredible volunteers like who run the food bank, and they've become a community, and they look after each other. And some of them said, you know what, I'm here every week, and I didn't used to do anything weekly. And actually, I don't see other people, but now I've got a community. We see it in synagogues. We see it in youth movements. We see it in the... I think it's a message we've got to shout a bit more loudly. I know you have to be careful because you can't exactly prove that, but I think that speaks to so many people in this room.
Yeah, I mean, I can't prove it on the basis of the data I shared, but as I said, there is a big literature on this, and yeah. I think others have proven it in the past. Which is part of the reason why I wasn't particularly anxious about sharing it, because I think the relationship is real. And yeah, you know, I mean, I think one of the remarkable things about Jewishness is that it's actually quite difficult to do Judaism on your own. You need community, right? I mean, in very simple terms, like traditionally you need a minyan to say Kaddish. That's a very kind of powerful concept. Like at that moment when you are feeling most vulnerable, you've just lost someone close to you, you have to have a group of people around you, right? And Judaism's really good at that. And that, has all sorts of inbuilt systems and structures. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, this kind of sociological research says this stuff is good, it's healthy, it's good for us.
And we all saw that only a few years ago during lockdown, right? We all saw that, and we all know that if it wasn't for technology, if it wasn't for the world of Zoom, we would have been so disconnected. And as soon as we at JW3 and so many of these organisations that you represent started putting things on Zoom, whether you were able to do services, or whether it was adult education, or whether it was JLGB's incredible stuff they did, or youth, whatever it was, that sense of connectivity. And we know that there is a mental health crisis with young people. We know that it's out there, and there's a lot of people still talking about, and the research is ongoing, about how much of that was being away from their classmates and their mates and being stuck. And we know that being on that, that's me on my phone, by the way. I'm not a very good mime artist. Being on that screen, in that little world by yourself, is just never going to be as healthy as either being in a real room with other people doing fun things, or being online with a group of people. Mm-hmm. I'm very conscious of time, and we really wanted to make sure that we have time. I mean, I don't want to hog all the questions. So we've got a room of very intelligent and informed people in the room. I'm buttering you up before I say the next bit, you see, which is, the rules, right? You've all been to these events everywhere. And you know what happens next. I'm going to say, please, let's make sure, in order to share the love and to share the questions, that when you get the microphone, you don't take 10 minutes to ask a question, and you don't make a very long statement with an upper inflection at the end to make it sound like it was a question. So, what I'm going to ask you to do is, if we can get some more lights on here, we have two people with microphones. I'm going to point out to you, and we're going to start with, I'm going to start with two people. So one for you, it's going to be the man at the back. The tall man at the back with the very tall arm must be Gid. I can't even tell, but it must be. And there's a woman, I'm sure, there's a lot of men with their hands up, and I'm sure that, there we go, over here in the middle, sorry, it's hard for me. Just kind of wave your hand, so that, there you go, over there. If we can get that to you, and you'll come second. What I'm going to ask you is, ask your question. As soon as you've finished it, pass the mic back. Okay, go for it.
Me first? Okay. The slide that got the murmur in the audience on the level of support, whether support for Israel, how important it was to your engagement. Did you ask the same question 10 years ago? And based on what you saw 10 years ago, is it that young people are just less engaged, or is this a trend that is now evolving over time? Our community is becoming a less important part of their identity.
Mm-hmm. So can you hold that one? And
yeah.
We'll take the second one?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
We'll take the second question. We'll answer those, and then we'll get another two people. So pop your hands down now, and I'll come back to you. So yes, please.
The second question, thank you, builds on the first one. Why wasn't belonging to a community or a youth group put in your list of what's important in terms of Jewish identity?
Thank you. Okay. So the first question was about, did you ask that question 10 years ago? Is there a trend?
Yep.
Is it a new phenomenon? Let's go for that one first.
We did ask it, and we saw very similar dynamic. And there is in the literature on this, which is mainly from the States. The phrase that is used is the distancing hypothesis. That kind of the younger people are, the more they feel kind of distance from Israel. As I said, I'm not sure that's exactly what's happening, and I think it's really important to probe it further. And I'm actually quite keen to use these data and hopefully data that we gather later this year to look at this properly, because I think exactly what people mean by that is important, right? So is it that it's just becoming sort of normative and therefore less front and center, or is it actually like genuinely becoming less important, and are people distancing in some way? So I think there's work to do to kind of unpick it and see what's going on. I think the whole question of the relationship with Israel has been thrown up in the air, obviously, by what's happened over the course of the last 4 months. So I think it's an important piece of the jigsaw puzzle and something that I really want to explore further. But fundamentally, that kind of age relationship we did see 10 years ago. Why wasn't belonging
So
to...
wait, before you come on to the other one, if I read it right, actual supporting Israel as an important part of Jewish identity went up slightly from 37% to 38%, if I looked at it right, overall, if we don't account for age.
Yes.
So it's more or less the same, slightly up, and that trend that will worry those of us that care about young people, and I can see parents as well as educators in the room thinking that's also been, it was worryingly low then and worryingly low now. I'm saying worryingly.
Yeah, I mean, I don't... It's a good question whether it's worryingly low or not. It kind of, as you saw, it sort of sits in the middle across denominations and across and to some extent across age bands. It's never right at the top. It's never kind of right at the bottom. Certainly across denominations, it sits in the middle. So, is that good? Is that bad? Should it be more central? Should it not be more central? I think is a question and a debate. And of course, we are. There is this post-October the 7th reality and whether that's shifted.
Okay.
The question about belonging to a community and youth movement, why was that not listed on the among the 18 items? Part of the reason is because when we do research, we inherit questions from the past, and we very deliberately construct questions in the way that they've been constructed in previous surveys, going back over several decades sometimes, to try and maintain the tradition. One of the principles of quantitative research is you try to make the questions replicable, so that you can kind of compare findings over time. But I think we looked at belonging to community, engagement in youth movements in different ways. So they are in there. They're just in there in slightly different ways. The question of what are the correct 18 items to use on that list? Well, there are 100 items, 200 items that one could potentially put into that question. And at a certain point, I think you have to try to focus in on the ones that partly have been used in the past, so that you can make those comparisons, and partly the ones that are going to resonate most. Is it perfect? No. Does it tell us something? Yes.
Okay, so so here we go. If you could come down for me, right to the very front row, and if you could just take where you are in the middle. Okay, there's a gentleman over here, very eager. Just wave your hand again, sir. There we go. So we're going to take you in the front row, and then you there, and we'll see if we can squeeze in another one or two, but there's a little bit more to go. So let's go. Nice and clear, brief question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting and thought-provoking. My question is about the underlying aim of this, which you said was to build a rich, meaningful and sustainable community. and provide data that the community leadership can use in order to achieve that. I'm interested in who you consider to be the community leadership and whether they are likely to use this data in order to promote their worldview and a community which is, above all, united, or a community which is dissident, argumentative, conflicted, and normal like any other community.
Great. Thank you very much. And you will be able to pick up copies of the report at the end of this. Let's get the second question.
Yes, hello. My question relates to the religiosity area. There was a statistic mentioned before the film that 57% of the community are members of synagogues. How has that statistic changed since 10 years earlier? And is there a breakdown of the relative performances of liberal, reform, traditional and Haredi?
Mm-hmm. Great question.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. You want to take the first one first, however you would like to take it?
Sure. Well, look, the first thing to say is JPR is a very deliberately apolitical organisation. We are not, and an independent organisation, so we are very deliberately not part of any of the kind of overarching community bodies. And that's partly because I think it's really important that we are seen as an independent research agency. It's also from a practical point of view, if we want to win, tenders as we do from, European Union, European Commission, like it's very important that we are an independent body. So we're not connected with any particular part of the Jewish community. All of that said, we work closely with all sorts of different organisations. My view on how we think about the data is that we've worked hard to try to build a data set that looks at Jewishness through lots of different lenses, lots of different denominational groups, age bands, lots of different issues, and it's really up to the community. And I use that term very, very broadly to say, if anybody wants to understand something in more detail, then please come and talk to us and say, I want to understand that particular aspect, whether it's kind of something about Israel or something about anti-Semitism or something about volunteering or something about charitable giving or whatever the theme is. But there's something in here that piques my interest, and I think that it would be helpful to understand in order to think about my organisation, whatever that organisation is. And our door is open. We have to charge for that work because somebody has to pay someone to do it. But the door is open, and we are very willing to work across the community on all those sorts of issues.
I'll jump in on that as someone who's not JPR. This place opened just over 10 years ago, but about 5 years before that, JPR were engaged to do a big piece of work for the founders of this organisation, for Dame Vivian Duffel and others, to consider, where it should be, what it should be, why does the community need it, and a lot of that. And I still have a report, from that time that we refer to. Fast forward till about 2-3 years ago, John and some of his colleagues have come in on our staff days to address our staff. What are the key issues facing the community and what should we be doing about it? Or even trustees, when we did some strategic planning about 5 years ago, again, we went to JPR to do a piece of work there. So actually some of this stuff happens behind, if I say behind closed doors, I mean it's not always in the public sphere, but there are organisations that need to grapple with this data, the leadership of the community, and decide, are we going to be the people that say, well, that data, it isn't in line with what I think, therefore it's irrelevant? Or are we going to say, okay, that's challenging to me and we need to do something about it? If you can just briefly answer that question, because I'm conscious of time, we've got a couple more bits to cover.
Yeah, sure. So there's a synagogue membership survey that is that's pending. The last one that was done was in 2016. But broadly speaking, what's happening is that synagogue membership is declining over time. And the main reason for that, incidentally, is less that people are not joining synagogues, and more a kind of a demographic shift. That in a lot of the smaller communities around the country, they're dying out. They're aging populations, and they're unable to sustain themselves. So a big piece of the reason why it's declining is actually to do with that. The picture, the denominational picture is the Haredi population is growing. However we look at it, it's growing and growing pretty significantly and strongly. That, by the way, is the kind of the counter side to the 613 rule that I shared. There's an important distinction between what's happening demographically and sociologically. Demographically, we are becoming increasingly Haredi, or that part of the community is growing and growing and growing. Sociologically, we are being pulled in a more kind of secularizing direction. I say that as an aside. In terms of other denominations, the progressive denominations are the latest data on them is that the Reform and Liberal are now sort of coming together. Reform are reasonably stable and have been over the course of the last 25 years or so. Liberal declining very slightly, but actually pretty stable. Masorti, very small, but has grown quite significantly. And the key part of the key kind of area, the mainstream Central Orthodox world, United Synagogue, Federation to a certain extent, some of the independent shuls that are under the auspices of the chief rabbi. That's the part of the community that has declined the most over the course of the last 25 years or so. So different pictures depending on different stories, depending on different denominations. But yeah, in general, that's the overarching picture.
Great, thank you. Now, I know there were about 20 or more hands up to ask questions, which is really great, and it's credit to John and his team. We won't have time here to have those questions. However, and I'm going to set John up for this, there is time afterwards. So we were always due to finish at 9, and we're going to keep to finishing at 9, which is in just under 15 minutes. But the cafe, we've kept the cafe staff waiting for you. We've kept them open. There will be, as we said, a chance to pick up a copy of this, and I'll remind you at the end about that, because it will be out there. And John, and there's some various trustees of JPR, there are other staff members of JPR here, they're wearing their nifty JPR badges. I know nothing, so don't ask me anything, but you can ask them, and certainly ask John, and carry on that conversation out there. But what I want to do is, we've got a couple more things we want to do. One is I just want to ask John, because sometimes we kvetch when we see some of these things, and we focus on the things that concern us and where things are in decline. So you know me, I like to have something very positive. So I want to ask you if you could just share one more slide with us on some of the positive stories, news, themes that come out. We won't have a discussion about them, and we'll just wrap up with a few more words.
Sure.
So the floor's yours.
Yeah, thank you. So a little story. When I first soon after I first started working in JPR, which is quite a while ago, I was at Limud actually, and I gave a presentation on data from the 2011 census. And I was really proud of it because I put a lot of work into it, and it was a really well constructed presentation. And I was like, this is a good piece of work. And it was to a large audience, really happy. Lots of people turned up. And at the end of it, a very good friend of mine who happened to be in the audience came up to me and said, "Oh, that was so depressing." And ever since then, I've been conscious that often when we kind of look at the data, I see the issues, I see the challenges, I see the problems, and perhaps particularly at this time when things feel really, really difficult here and in the Jewish world and in Israel. I kind of thought we should finish in that way. So I'm going to finish with Hatikva. Don't worry, you don't have to sing, but I mean it in the literal sense. What are the signs of hope or positivity in this? And I just want to share a few things that I think are really sort of encouraging and that actually make me really proud of this community. And I think there's a lot of that stuff in this report. The first is that our Jewishness really matters to us. So when we ask people, how important is your Jewishness to you? On a scale of 0 to 10, the average score across the Jewish population is 8.3. That's very high. We care about this stuff. We really care about it. It matters deeply. And by the way, I think that's why we really need to take it seriously, and we really need to take how we build our community and how we build our community institutions seriously. The second thing that really strikes me is this issue about the kind of the moral and ethical behaviour piece, that we agree across our denominational differences that there is this kind of moral imperative within Jewishness. As I said earlier, we may well have different definitions of it, but we're part of a proud tradition, a proud moral tradition, and I think generally across the denominational spectrum, we want to contribute, and we see some of the interesting things in that data. 89% of British Jews made a charitable donation of some kind, at least one, in the year prior to the survey. That is much, much higher than the equivalent figure for general society. 57% of people said they volunteer in some way, at least once during the year before, for a Jewish organisation. 46% said the same for non-Jewish charities. We get involved, we contribute, and we should be really proud of that. There are very high levels of communal engagement. 73% say they feel a close sense of attachment to Israel. It's a different way that we measured kind of engagement with Israel. 72%, we hadn't looked at this before, but 72% said they'd seen a film or a series on a Jewish theme on TV or a streaming service. I don't mean to be flippant about that, but there are new kind of ways of people finding their Jewishness on their own. And a lot of people do. A lot of people engage with that material. And some of that material is Israeli material that's now become much more available. How does that impact our sense of Jewishness? I'm a big fan of Fauda.
There's also a great cinema that shows that stuff all year round.
Really? Where would that be?
Just saying, just down the road. You can purchase your tickets.
71% of us attend a Seder every year. The same proportion also kind of light candles or go to the Hanukkah candle lighting ceremony at least once every year. 61% of people say they attend a Friday night meal most weeks. 61% say they feel strongly or at least moderately attached to their Jewish community. 58% say that they participate in some kind of adult Jewish learning event, at least one at some point annually. These are pretty high figures, right, in this report. So we're very engaged. We're very committed. And as I said, this stuff matters to us. I think there's a huge amount to build on here. And we should build on it. And we should be proud of the levels of engagement that exist. So, these are just some snapshots. I think there's a lot more, and maybe people will find other signs of positivity. Notwithstanding that, there are challenges as well, as there always are. It's good news, it's bad news, and we'll figure it out between us. I just want to finish just very quickly with a few thank yous. Again, to Raymond and the team here at JW3. I really want to thank the whole JPR team for all the help they gave, and particularly Carly and David, who worked very hard on the actual survey and the report, but also others have been involved in all sorts of ways behind the scene, Richard and Judith and Stephanie and Omri and Adam, and we've had interns working for us, supporting us as well. Izzy, who no longer works for us but worked hard on this as well. There are a lot of people that were kind of involved in this work, and I really want to express my gratitude to them. I also really want to express my gratitude to the trustees of JPR, who really work hard, talking of people who volunteer. They volunteer, they give up their time in all sorts of ways, and put their hands in their pocket to help us as well in all sorts of ways, led by Stephen Moss and David Herrera, but there are a whole load of other trustees that are also involved. I really want to express my appreciation to them. I also want to express the people who helped to fund this research. I'm not going to go through them all because I know I'm going to forget someone and I'll get into trouble, but they're all listed in the research, partly in the interest of thanking them, but also I think in the interest of just being open about who invested in this research, and they are all there, and they are the people who funded this work are kind of critical. They play a really, really important role in the community, and often an unsung role in the community, because without them, we just wouldn't have this data, and we would be, community leaders, I think, would be flying blind to all intents and purposes, trying to make decisions on the basis of intuition and anecdote. This stuff is important if we want to take our community seriously and if we want to build a future. And it's those donors, and again, they're all listed in the report, who get that and invest. So I just want to express my appreciation to them as well. It's important for me to say that.
Good. important. Come and join me just for this final bit, for the last,
Yeah.
last few minutes. I think you've pretty much said all the thank yous, so I'm not going to add any more thank yous. I want to echo what John said about the need really for, there are no appeal cards or pledge cards under your seats, but, funding this kind of, it's not the sexy thing to fund. It is for us, but for other people. But actually, the importance of decision-making in the community based on data, we need to be able to invest in more research. That's unquestionable. And as I said, as a community professional and as a trustee of other charities, I know that I rely on this kind of stuff. So I think it's really important. Whatever you do when we finish, make sure you go and pick up. There are not enough copies for one per person. So if you're here, if there's a few of you from the same organisation, just take one for that organisation. If you're here from the same household, please take one for that household, even if you're from two different organisations. I want to tell you very quickly about two things that are coming up, just because I can, because I'm here, which is, you might have noticed, although it might have been dark and it was raining and you didn't see, just installed about an hour before you arrived, a brand new installation. It's the first time we've ever done anything like this. It's on the outside, the glass outer perimeter of the building. Has some very brightly coloured, and please come back during the daytime where you can see it. They're posters. They're in the style of posters that promote a gig or a festival or whatever, and they are real quotes. It's an artist called Max Bloom, a young Jewish artist who came here and interviewed people about 3-4 weeks after October 7th, asking people how they felt. Mostly, these were people who work. These aren't Jewish community professionals. These are people who work, in other fields, and asked them how they are feeling about the current situation. And then he spoke to more people about a month later, and he's taken about 20 of the quotes, and they've been turned into ginormous posters as a reflection of how the community is feeling. And it's a piece of art. It's an installation called Conflicted, and it's on the outside of the building. And it's another big, bold, brave thing that we're doing. From this Sunday, from 2:30 p.m. this Sunday, and ongoing for however many days the hostage situation continues, we are turning our bridge, the bridge that you came in, into the Love Lock hostage bridge. Those Love Lock bridges that you've seen across Europe, where you express your love for your lover, your partner, we want to express our love and support for the hostages. We're starting with 100 plus padlocks that have the names of the hostages that we know that are still held. There are a whole bunch of padlocks that have been signed by high-profile people and celebrities, and a whole bunch of them are going to be here for a very small media launch. But then it's open to all of you. You don't even have to bring your own padlock. We're making it as easy as we can. Marcel Noble, who I'm sure some of you know, had this genius idea. We're working with him. Some very kind anonymous donors have donated the money to buy a whole load of padlocks. We have many, many hundreds of padlocks. You'll be able to come anytime from Sunday afternoon, pick up a padlock, pick up one of the special pens that's waterproof, weatherproof, and write a message of love, attach it. But really what we want you to do is to take photos and videos and share it on social media. There'll be information up there at box office. So come back anytime next week and do that. But the last very special thing that I'm really excited about. So John and I are old friends. We're colleagues. We've worked together many years. We were at different points. We crossed over at university, Jewish Studies Department at UCL. We came through the kind of youth movement sector. And one of the things we most like to do, as you will not be surprised to hear, is sit and talk. And we regularly get together and say, we're just going to meet for half an hour for a coffee and a chat. And 2 hours later, we've just opened the entire community and we're talking about it. And at some point, some clever person, not us, had the idea that we should take the data that JPR have been working on and the conversations that we have and put those together and create a podcast. Because as they say, what do you call two pale, stale male men having a conversation? A podcast, right? So with the help of our brilliant producer, Richard Myron, we have been working hard to put together a brand new podcast series that takes some of the key issues that come out of this. I did not approve of that.
Nor did I.
But look at the adoration and love in my eyes to this great man. Oh, now the camera's come out. Oh, I see. Oh, that's the slide you want to... Yeah, thank you. That is a QR code. I've been told by my teenage son that a QR... No, you all know what a QR code is. Point your camera at it, focus in on it. It will take you to a page. At that point, you'll be able to get the first episode, and B, you'll be able to download. It will be a link to download the JPR report, this one. But what we're going to do is just play you, for the first time ever, we haven't really heard it yet. We're going to play you, it's 1 minute and 20 seconds. We're going to play you the trailer for our podcast series to give you a flavour. So we're going to sit here and cringe. If you just play the roll sound.
Jews do count.
Yes, you heard that right. Jews do count. That's not just a statement, but also the name of our new podcast. With me, Raymond Simonson, CEO of JW3, the home for Jewish culture and conversation.
And me, Jonathan Boyd, the Executive Director of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, the research and policy think tank working to shape the future of Jewish life in the UK and across Europe. And in this podcast, we're going to be lifting the lid on what Jewish identity is today, what matters most to British Jews in terms of their Jewish lives, and what, if anything, binds us together.
And that involves looking at the very latest JPR research on what we think about a whole host of issues. God and religiosity, ethics, morals and values, our relationship with Israel, how we're managing the anxieties and concerns about anti-Semitism, and ultimately what we have in common and how we build our shared future.
And in each episode, we're going to be having conversations with insightful educators, activists and thinkers from across the varied world of the British Jewish community.
And all you have to do is subscribe and download and listen wherever it is you get your podcast from. Tell your friends and family all about this new podcast from the Institute for Jewish Policy Research and JW3. Jews do count.
Yes, that's right.
Cringe.
So, apart from squirming in our seats, every Thursday over the next 6-7 weeks, I've lost count. 7 weeks.
Yeah.
A new episode will drop. Getting the lingo right there, Richard. A new episode will drop and you'll be able to download it. The very first episode is now live. You'll be able to do that. And my final word is, when we say Jews do count, 2 observations. Number one, as you can see from everything that John presented tonight and that we talk about also in the series, as we say, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. We know that very clearly. And the other thing is, there are 180, 190 people in the room tonight. There's about 250 people that booked a ticket. That means a bunch of people aren't in the room. And if you're not in the room, you don't count. You can't count in the conversations about Jewish life that matter if you are not in the room. In all the rooms that you run, in all the rooms that you're part of, we need to get more people in the rooms for those conversations. Please, if you make your way out, give us a chance to take our microphones off, and then John and the team will join you. You'll be able to pick up your copy at the end of the cafe. There'll be JPR staff there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.